Death at the Winter Funeral. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with us again tonight. I'd love to ask you something. What is it that makes you enjoy these cozy mysteries? Share your reason in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Frostbitten. Arrival. The carriage wheels crunched through the frozen snow with a sound that reminded Tuppence Beresford of someone eating particularly stale biscuits. She peered through the frost-etched window at the looming silhouette of Whitmore Manor, its Gothic towers rising like accusatory fingers against the pewter sky. "I say, Tommy," she remarked, pulling her fur collar closer about her throat. "This place looks positively medieval. Are you quite certain we weren't invited to a haunting rather than a funeral?" Her husband, Thomas Beresford, adjusted his position on the uncomfortable carriage seat and followed her gaze. "My dear Tuppence, after 30 years of marriage, I should think you'd have learned that I'm never quite certain of anything. It keeps life interesting." "How reassuring," Tuppence replied dryly. "Still, one would think Lord Whitmore might have chosen a more cheerful venue for his brother's send-off. This place looks as though it's been expecting a death for centuries." The carriage lurched through an imposing iron gate, its bars twisted into patterns that might have been roses or might have been thorns. In the swirling snow, it was impossible to tell. Ancient oaks lined the drive, their bare branches forming a skeletal canopy overhead. Ivy crept over the manor's stone walls like green veins, and despite the February chill, Tuppence could almost feel the building's brooding presence. "Rather atmospheric, isn't it?" Tommy observed, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Perfectly suited for a mystery novel." "Don't say such things," Tuppence chided, though her eyes sparkled with interest. "We're meant to be paying our respects to the dear departed, not looking for adventure." "Of course, darling," Tommy replied. "Though I notice you've already catalogued every window and doorway we've passed." "Purely architectural appreciation," Tuppence replied with mock dignity. The carriage drew to a halt before the manor's main entrance, where warm light spilled from tall windows onto the snow-covered steps. A figure emerged from the massive oak doors, a man of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, though there was a weariness about his shoulders that spoke of recent grief. "Lord Whitmore," Tommy murmured as he helped Tuppence from the carriage. Their host approached with measured steps, his polite smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, how good of you to make the journey in such weather. I'm Charles Whitmore." His handshake was firm but brief. "My dear wife Margaret is inside by the fire. I trust you'll forgive us if the household seems somewhat subdued. My brother's passing has been a shock to us all." "Please don't concern yourself with our comfort," Tuppence said warmly. "We were honored by your invitation, though I confess we knew your brother only slightly from the club." "Ah, yes," Lord Whitmore replied. "Poor Edmund was quite fond of his evenings at the Savoy Club." His expression grew distant. "Come, you must be frozen through. James will see to your luggage." As they approached the entrance, Tuppence noticed something odd. In the snow beside the main path, a set of footprints led away from the house toward what appeared to be a small chapel visible through the bare trees. The prints were partially filled with fresh snow, suggesting they'd been made some time ago, yet they were too distinct to be very old. "Curious," she murmured to Tommy. "What's that, darling?" "Those footprints. Rather an odd time for a stroll, wouldn't you think?" Tommy glanced casually in the direction she indicated. Perhaps someone couldn't sleep. Grief affects people differently. Inside, the manor's great hall rose to impressive heights, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows above. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing light across tapestries and oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmores from centuries past. The air carried the scent of wood smoke, beeswax, and something else. Something faintly floral and out of place. A woman approached from the drawing room, her elegant black dress rustling softly. Lady Margaret Whitmore was perhaps 10 years younger than her husband, with auburn hair showing only a few threads of silver and green eyes that missed very little. "Mrs. Beresford, how lovely to meet you at last," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Charles has spoken of your husband's war service. Such brave men, both of them." "You're very kind," Tuppence replied, noting the slight tension in Lady Whitmore's voice, as though she were holding something back. "Your home is magnificent. Such history in these walls." "Yes, rather too much history at times," Lady Margaret replied with a laugh that didn't quite ring true. "But where are my manners? You must meet the staff who will be looking after you during your stay." A tall, thin man appeared as if summoned, his movements precise and economical. "This is James, our butler. He's been with the family for 20 years. James bowed slightly, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the new arrivals with professional assessment. "Sir, madam, I trust your journey wasn't too arduous. The weather has been quite unpredictable." "We managed admirably, thank you," Tommy replied, studying the man's impassive face. There was something in James's manner, a careful neutrality, that suggested he knew more than he was saying. A plump woman emerged from a side corridor, her round face creased with concern. "This is Mrs. Collins, our housekeeper. She keeps us all in line." Mrs. Collins bobbed a curtsy, her keen eyes darting between the guests and her employers. "Welcome to Whitmore Manor. I've prepared the blue room for you. It has the best view of the gardens, though I'm afraid there's not much to see with all this snow." "I'm sure it will be perfect," Tuppence assured her, noting how the housekeeper's gaze lingered on the main hall table, where a funeral wreath sat slightly askew, as though it had been hastily placed there. A younger man appeared from the shadows near the staircase, moving with nervous energy. "And this is Oliver, a footman," Lord Whitmore added, his tone suggesting mild irritation. "Oliver, please show our guests to their room so they might refresh themselves before dinner." Oliver stepped forward, his movements quick and somewhat jerky. He was perhaps 25, with thinning fair hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. "Certainly, my lord. If you'd follow me, please." As they climbed the grand staircase, Tuppence caught sight of something glinting behind a large flower pot on the landing. Something small and metallic, a key, by the look of it, though what it might unlock was anyone's guess. "Interesting household," she murmured to Tommy as they followed Oliver down a lengthy corridor lined with portraits. "Quite," Tommy agreed quietly. "Everyone seems rather on edge, don't you think?" Oliver paused at a heavy oak door and produced a key from his pocket. "The blue room, sir, madam. Dinner is at 8. Will there be anything else you require?" "No, thank you," Tommy replied. "You've been most helpful." As the footman departed, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with unusual haste, Tuppence moved to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered grounds. "Tommy," she said slowly. "Look at this." He joined her at the window. Below, the chapel she'd noticed earlier stood partially hidden among bare trees, its door slightly ajar despite the cold. A thin line of light was visible in the gap, suggesting someone was inside. "Rather late for prayers, wouldn't you say?" Tommy observed. "Or rather early for something else entirely," Tuppence replied, her eyes gleaming with the familiar light that preceded their most interesting adventures. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the night and covering whatever secrets Whitmore Manor might hold. But inside the blue room, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford exchanged knowing looks, their instincts already alert to the undercurrents of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of their temporary home. The funeral was to be tomorrow, but already death seemed to be casting longer shadows than grief alone could account for. Chapter 2. Gathering of the Mourners. The morning brought no respite from the snow, and by 10 o'clock, Whitmore Manor's circular drive resembled a staging ground for Arctic exploration. From their bedroom window, Tuppence watched as carriages arrived one after another, their occupants emerging like dark moths against the white landscape. "Rather like a scene from a Russian novel," she observed, adjusting her black morning dress with its modest pearl buttons. "All we need is a sleigh and some wolves howling in the distance." Tommy straightened his black tie with the precision of a man who had performed the ritual countless times during their years of adventure. "I do hope you're not planning to howl yourself, darling. We're supposed to be inconspicuous guests, remember?" "When have I ever failed to be inconspicuous?" Tuppence asked with mock innocence. "Shall I compile a list?" "It might take some time." Their playful banter was interrupted by a knock at the door. Oliver's voice came through the heavy oak. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, Lord Whitmore requests that you join the other guests in the drawing room at your convenience." "We'll be down directly," Tommy called back, then lowered his voice. "Ready to meet our fellow mourners?" "More than ready," Tuppence replied, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I have a feeling this gathering will prove most illuminating." The drawing room had been transformed since their arrival the previous evening. Additional chairs had been arranged in conversational groupings, and James moved between them with military precision, ensuring each guest had everything required. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, but the atmosphere remained subdued, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Lord Whitmore approached them immediately, his manner slightly more strained than it had been upon their arrival. "Ah, the Beresfords. Allow me to introduce you to our other guests." He guided them first to a distinguished gentleman standing near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece with studied casualness. The man was perhaps 50, with silver at his temples and the kind of bearing that suggested military service or politics. "Sir Reginald Ashton," Lord Whitmore announced. Reggie was Edmund's oldest friend from their Oxford days. Sir Reginald stepped forward with a charming smile that didn't quite dispel the watchful quality in his pale blue eyes. "Delighted to meet you both." Edmund spoke of the Savoy Club with great fondness. "I believe you mentioned your war service, Mr. Beresford." "Nothing worth discussing in polite company," Tommy replied diplomatically, though Tuppence noted how Sir Reginald's gaze swept the room, even as he spoke, cataloging exits and occupants with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "And this," Lord Whitmore continued, drawing them toward a quiet figure seated near the window, "is Miss Eleanor Field. She was Edmund's secretary for many years." Miss Field rose gracefully, a woman of perhaps 40 with prematurely gray hair arranged in a simple chignon and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Her morning dress was well-made but not expensive, and her hands bore the telltale ink stains of someone who worked with documents regularly. "How do you do?" she said softly, her voice carrying just a hint of a Yorkshire accent. "Mr. Edmund was very kind to speak of his club friends. He particularly enjoyed your unusual adventures, Mrs. Beresford." "You're very kind," Tuppence replied, intrigued by the slight hesitation before secretary in Lord Whitmore's introduction. "You must have known him quite well." A shadow passed over Miss Field's features. "As well as anyone, I suppose. He was a very private gentleman in many ways." Before the conversation could continue, Lord Whitmore was steering them toward another group. "Reverend Blackwood has just arrived from the village. He'll be conducting tomorrow's service." The clergyman was a tall, spare man with the kind of ascetic features that belonged in a medieval manuscript. His handshake was firm, but Tuppence noticed how his eyes avoided direct contact, focusing instead on a point just over her left shoulder. "A sad occasion," Reverend Blackwood intoned, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of countless funeral orations. "Though I confess I knew Mr. Edmund only slightly." The family has not been regular in attendance at morning service. Lord Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Edmund was never one for early rising, I'm afraid. Of course, the Reverend replied quickly, though his tone suggested this was not the first time the subject had caused friction. The Lord calls us all in his own time. Speaking of time, interrupted a cheerful voice, I do hope we're not keeping everyone from their breakfast. I know I could manage a bit of kippers myself. The speaker was a retired gentleman of perhaps 60, with wild gray hair that suggested he dressed in considerable haste. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, and he clutched a leather satchel as though it contained the crown jewels. Dr. Lionel Hawkes, Lord Whitmore said with the first genuine warmth he'd shown all morning, our local historian and the leading authority on Whitmore family lore. Lionel, meet the Beresfords. Dr. Hawkes pumped their hands enthusiastically. Absolutely delighted, I say. You're not the Beresfords who sorted out that business with the missing diplomat? Fascinating case. I read all about it in the papers. Dr. Hawkes is rather obsessed with mystery and intrigue, Lord Whitmore explained with fond exasperation. Occupational hazard, I'm afraid, the doctor replied cheerfully. When you spend your days poking about in old documents and family secrets, you develop quite an appetite for puzzles. The Whitmores have provided me with decades of research material. Oh? Tuppence asked with carefully casual interest. Mysteries in the family history? My dear lady, every old family has its mysteries. Hidden passages, disputed inheritances, unexplained disappearances. The Whitmores have it all. Why? There's a fascinating legend about the family vault. Now, Lionel? Lady Margaret interrupted smoothly, appearing at Dr. Hawkes's elbow with a teacup. We mustn't bore our guests with ancient history. But Tuppence had caught the sharp look that passed between Lord and Lady Whitmore, and she filed the information away for future consideration. And here, Lady Margaret continued, guiding them toward the far corner of the room, are Charles's cousins, Philip and Winifred. The cousins stood close together near a tall bookshelf, their heads bent in intense conversation that ceased abruptly as the introductions were made. Philip Whitmore was a thin, nervous man of perhaps 45, with the pale complexion of a city clerk and fingers stained with ink. His sister Winifred was several years younger, with sharp features and an assessing gaze that reminded Tuppence uncomfortably of a bird of prey. Cousins, Philip corrected with precision that bordered on pedantry. Second cousins, to be exact. Our grandfather was Charles's great-uncle. How lovely to have family at such a difficult time, Tuppence said pleasantly. Winifred's smile was thin. We felt it our duty to attend naturally, though Edmund never showed much interest in family connections during his lifetime. Winifred, Philip murmured warningly. Well, it's true, she replied, her voice carrying just far enough to be overheard by several other guests. He was always too busy with his London life to visit properly. Tommy caught Tuppence's eye and raised an eyebrow slightly. The undercurrents in this room were becoming more apparent by the moment. James appeared at Lord Whitmore's elbow with silent efficiency. My lord, luncheon will be served in the dining room at your convenience. Excellent, Lord Whitmore replied, though he seemed more relieved than pleased. Shall we adjourn? I'm sure everyone could use some sustenance after their journeys. As the guests began to move toward the dining room, Tuppence lingered near the fireplace, ostensibly adjusting her brooch, but actually observing the various groupings that formed naturally. Sir Reginald moved with purpose toward Miss Field, who seemed to shrink slightly at his approach. Dr. Hawkes was gesticulating enthusiastically at Reverend Blackwood, who maintained his distance with ecclesiastical politeness. The cousins walked together in whispered conference, their expressions suggesting their earlier conversation was far from concluded. Interesting dynamics, Tommy murmured as he offered her his arm. Fascinating, Tuppence agreed quietly. Did you notice how everyone reacted when Dr. Hawkes mentioned family secrets? Rather like cats when someone mentions dogs, I thought. As they followed the other mourners from the room, Tuppence glanced back toward the fireplace and froze. There, scattered on the Persian carpet where Sir Reginald had been standing, lay several dark gloves, far more than one person would reasonably drop. But before she could examine them more closely, Oliver appeared and began collecting them with nervous efficiency. "Tommy," she whispered urgently. But her husband had already noticed the footman's flustered movements, and the way James watched from the doorway with disapproving eyes. "After lunch, darling," Tommy replied softly. "I have a feeling our afternoon stroll might prove most educational." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with solemn persistence. Chapter 3. A cryptic note. Luncheon had been a peculiar affair, with conversations that died abruptly whenever certain subjects arose, and glances exchanged across the mahogany table like coded messages. Tuppence had counted at least 3 occasions, when someone had begun to speak of Edmund, only to fall silent under Lady Margaret's watchful gaze. Now, with the afternoon stretching before them, and the other guests presumably resting in their rooms, Tommy and Tuppence found themselves alone in the great hall. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the flagstone floor. "I don't suppose," Tuppence said thoughtfully, "that we might take a small tour of the house. Purely for historical appreciation, of course." "Of course," Tommy agreed solemnly, "though I suspect Lord Whitmore might not appreciate us wandering into private quarters." "Then we shall simply have to be discreet." They made their way up the, grand staircase, noting how the floorboards creaked in predictable patterns. Useful information for anyone wishing to move about undetected. The upper corridor was lined with doors, most of which stood firmly closed, but at the far end one door was slightly ajar. "Edmund's study," Tuppence murmured, recognizing the nameplate that read E. Whitmore in elegant script. "Are you suggesting we investigate a dead man's private sanctum?" Tommy asked with mock horror. "I'm suggesting we pay our respects to his memory by admiring his scholarly pursuits." The study was smaller than Tuppence had expected, with tall windows overlooking the chapel they had noticed the previous evening. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its leather surface covered with papers that had clearly been disturbed recently. Not rifled exactly, but sorted and examined by someone seeking something specific. Tommy moved toward the bookshelves, running his finger along the leather spines. "Interesting collection. Military history, archaeology. And what's this?" He paused, extracting a slim volume. "A guide to European monasteries. Rather specialized reading." Tuppence was examining the desk more closely, her trained eye cataloging the arrangement of objects. "Tommy, look at this blotter. See how the papers have been moved? Someone's been through these documents quite recently. Perhaps Lady Margaret or Lord Whitmore were settling his affairs." "Perhaps," Tuppence replied, but something in her tone suggested she found this explanation insufficient. It was then that she noticed it. A cream-colored envelope wedged between 2 leather-bound volumes on the shelf nearest the window. The paper was expensive, and it bore no address or marking, save for a small water stain that suggested it had been handled by damp fingers. "Tommy," she said quietly, "come look at this." He joined her at the shelf as she carefully extracted the envelope. It was sealed, but not with wax, merely tucked closed in the old-fashioned way. Inside was a single sheet of matching paper, and, written in an elegant but hurried hand, were 7 words that made them both draw breath sharply. "Not all is as it seems beneath the frost." They stared at the cryptic message in silence for a moment, each turning over the possible meanings. The handwriting was educated but showed signs of haste, as though the writer had been pressed for time or working under emotional strain. Rather melodramatic, Tommy observed, though his tone lacked its usual levity. Or rather urgent, Tuppence countered. This wasn't written by someone with leisure to compose poetry. Look at the way the ink's blotted here and here. Whoever wrote this was either very cold or very frightened. A sound in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps, measured and deliberate, were approaching the study. Tommy slipped the note into his waistcoat pocket just as the door opened wider. Oh. Miss Field stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her throat in apparent surprise. I do beg your pardon. I didn't realize anyone was here. Please don't apologize, Tuppence said smoothly. We were just admiring Mr. Edmund's scholarly collection. Such an impressive array of books. Miss Field's eyes swept the room with an intensity that belied her mild demeanor. Yes, he was quite devoted to his research. May I ask what brought you to his study specifically? It was a reasonable question, but there was something in her tone that suggested more than idle curiosity. Tommy stepped forward with his most disarming smile. Lady Margaret mentioned that Edmund had a particular interest in local history. We thought we might find something about the manor itself. I see. Miss Field moved into the room, her gaze lingering on the desk where the papers had been so recently disturbed. He was indeed fascinated by the Whitmore family history, perhaps too fascinated, some might say. An unusual comment, Tuppence observed gently. Surely family history is a harmless pursuit. Something flickered across Miss Field's features. Fear, perhaps, or regret. Harmless, yes. But Edmund had uncovered certain irregularities in the family records. Nothing scandalous, you understand, but the sort of thing that might prove embarrassing if brought to light. What sort of irregularities? Tommy asked with casual interest. Miss Field hesitated, clearly torn between discretion and some inner compulsion to speak. Questions about inheritance, mainly documents that didn't quite align with official records. Edmund was convinced that someone in the family's past had been, shall we say, creative with the truth. Before either Tommy or Tuppence could respond, another voice spoke from the doorway. Eleonora, there you are. Sir Reginald stood framed in the entrance, his expression unreadable. Lady Margaret was looking for you. Something about the arrangements for tomorrow. Miss Field's face went pale. Of course. I was explaining to Mr. and Mrs. Beresford about Edmund's historical interests. How thoughtful. Sir Reginald's tone was pleasant enough, but his eyes remained cold. Though I'm sure our guests have better things to do than pore over dusty family documents. Quite right, Tommy agreed easily. We were just leaving. As they moved toward the door, Tuppence caught sight of something that made her pulse quicken. There, on the small table beside Edmund's reading chair, was a stack of correspondence tied with a blue ribbon. The topmost letter bore the distinctive heading of a London law firm, and though she could not read the contents from her position, the letter suggested matters of considerable legal importance. In the corridor, Sir Reginald lingered as Miss Field hurried away toward the main staircase. I do hope Eleonora wasn't burdening you with family gossip, he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The poor woman has been rather overwrought since Edmund's passing. They worked very closely together, you understand. She seems devoted. To preserving his memory, Tuppence replied diplomatically. Devoted? Yes. Perhaps a bit too devoted if you take my meaning. Sir Reginald's smile became strained. Edmund was a bachelor, of course, but he was also a man of the world. Certain attachments can become complicated. With that cryptic observation, He strode away, leaving Tommy and Tuppence alone in the corridor. They waited until his footsteps had faded before speaking. "Well," Tommy said quietly. "That was illuminating." "Quite," Tuppence agreed. "Though I'm not certain which revelation was more significant. The note, Miss Field's nervous confession, about family irregularities, or Sir Reginald's rather pointed comments about complicated attachments." Tommy patted his waistcoat where the mysterious note rested. "I suspect we've stumbled onto something rather more complex than a simple case of family grief. And tomorrow is the funeral." Tuppence's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "I have a feeling that ceremony may prove more eventful than anyone anticipates." Outside, the winter afternoon was drawing toward dusk, and the snow continued its relentless fall. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed 4 times, its sonorous notes echoing through corridors that seemed to hold far more secrets than any respectable family home should reasonably contain. Chapter 4. The Chapel Ceremony. The morning of Edmund Whitmore's funeral dawned gray and bitter, with snow still falling in determined flakes that seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. By 10 o'clock, the small procession had formed. Outside the manor's main entrance, a somber parade of black-clad figures moving slowly through the white landscape toward the family chapel. Tuppence pulled her fur coat closer as they walked, noting how the snow crunched differently under various footsteps, some confident and measured, others hesitant or hurried. Tommy walked beside her with the careful gait of a man mindful of treacherous footing, though she suspected his apparent concentration on the path masked his usual keen observation of their fellow mourners. "Rather like a scene from a Gothic novel," she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. "All we need is a raven perched on the chapel roof." "Don't tempt fate, darling," Tommy replied softly. "I have the distinct feeling this ceremony may provide quite enough drama without avian assistance." The chapel itself was a charming Norman structure that might have been picturesque under different circumstances. Now, with its ancient stones dark against the snow and wisps of smoke rising from the small chimney, it possessed an atmosphere of brooding solemnity that made even Tuppence's irrepressible spirits feel subdued. Inside, the space was intimate, perhaps 20 pews in total, with stone walls that had witnessed centuries of Whitmore family celebrations and sorrows. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. The air was heavy with the scent of old incense and winter roses, though Tuppence noticed an underlying mustiness that spoke of infrequent use. Reverend Blackwood stood at the simple altar, his tall figure draped in ceremonial robes that emphasized his ascetic features. Before him, Edmund's coffin rested on an ornate bier, covered with a heavy pall of black velvet that bore the Whitmore coat of arms embroidered in silver thread. The seating arrangements Tuppence observed told their own story. Lord and Lady Whitmore occupied the front pew on the right, their bearing rigid with grief and social responsibility. Directly behind them sat the cousins Philip and Winifred, whose whispered exchanges had continued throughout the walk from the manor. Sir Reginald had positioned himself across the aisle, with an excellent view of both the altar and the other mourners, while Miss Field sat alone in the third pew, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her black gloves. Dr. Hawkes had claimed a seat near the back, his leather satchel resting at his feet, and his eyes darting about the chapel with unconcealed fascination. Tommy and Tuppence had taken places in the middle section, a position that afforded them optimal observation of the entire assembly. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Blackwood began, his voice echoing strangely in the small space, "we are gathered here to commit to the earth the mortal remains of our brother Edmund Charles Whitmore." The service proceeded with traditional solemnity. Tuppence found herself increasingly distracted by small irregularities that seemed to accumulate like snowflakes. The hymnals, for instance, were misaligned in the pew racks, not dramatically, but enough to suggest someone had been handling them recently and hastily. More puzzling was the fact that the candle nearest the altar had clearly been extinguished and relit within the past few hours, as evidenced by the pool of fresh wax at its base. During the first hymn, a minor commotion arose when Dr. Hawkes, reaching into his satchel for what appeared to be a handkerchief, knocked against his neighbor and sent a small shower of papers fluttering to the floor. The good doctor's apologies were profuse, and his scramble to retrieve the documents somewhat undignified, but Tuppence noticed that Miss Field had gone quite pale during the brief disruption. Tommy, meanwhile, was studying the chapel's architectural details with the apparent appreciation of a medieval enthusiast, though she knew he was actually cataloging every entrance, window, and potential hiding place. His attention seemed particularly focused on the small vestry door behind the altar, which stood slightly ajar despite the cold. As Reverend Blackwood launched into his eulogy, a carefully neutral recitation of Edmund's life that managed to convey information, while revealing remarkably little about the man himself, another small incident occurred. Sir Reginald, shifting in his pew, accidentally knocked his walking stick against the stone floor. The sharp crack echoed through the chapel, and in the moment of startled silence that followed, everyone turned to look at him. His apologies were smooth and practiced, but Tuppence caught the brief flash of irritation that crossed his features. Edmund Whitmore was a man of many interests, the Reverend continued, his voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been emotion or merely cold. His studies into local history brought him great satisfaction, and his discoveries enriched our understanding of this ancient place. At these words, Tuppence noticed several significant reactions. Dr. Hawkes leaned forward with obvious interest. Lady Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the cousins exchanged another of their meaningful glances. Most telling of all was Miss Field's response. She pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, but her shoulders shook with what appeared to be distress rather than simple grief. The service was nearing its conclusion when the most dramatic incident occurred. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Winifred Whitmore stumbled slightly, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the pew. In doing so, she knocked against a small vase of winter roses that had been placed on the window ledge behind her seat. The vase fell to the stone floor with a sharp crash, sending water and flowers scattering across the ancient stones. The sound was startling in the reverent silence, and for a moment everyone froze. Then James, the butler, who had been standing discreetly at the back of the chapel, moved forward with quiet efficiency to begin cleaning up the mess. As he knelt to gather the scattered roses, Tuppence noticed something odd. Beneath the flowers, barely visible against the dark stone, was a thin trail of white powder that looked remarkably like salt. "How clumsy of me," Winifred murmured, though her voice carried more irritation than embarrassment. "I do hope I haven't disrupted the service." "Not at all," Reverend Blackwood assured her, though his eyes remained fixed on the spot where the flowers had fallen. "These old buildings can be treacherous underfoot." As the final prayers were spoken and the congregation prepared to follow the coffin to its final resting place in the family vault, Tuppence found herself studying the black velvet pall more closely. There was something not quite right about its arrangement, a slight displacement near the foot end, as though it had been disturbed and hastily rearranged. "Tommy," she whispered as they filed out into the snow-filled air, "did you notice anything odd about the coffin drapery?" "I was rather more interested in that curious little trail of powder near the window," he replied quietly. "Though I grant you, the pall did seem somewhat askew." "And did you observe how everyone reacted when the Reverend mentioned Edmund's historical discoveries?" Like guilty schoolchildren when the headmaster mentions missing sweets, Tommy agreed. I suspect our dear departed Edmund uncovered rather more than ancient architectural details as they followed the procession toward the family vault. Forbidding stone structure built into the hillside beyond the chapel, Tuppence felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to take shape. The various small incidents during the service. The misaligned hymnals, the relit candle, the scattered papers, the fallen flowers, and that mysterious trail of powder might individually be meaningless. Collectively, however, they suggested that this solemn ceremony had been anything but peaceful. The snow continued to fall as they approached the vault, its ancient iron gates standing open like the mouth of some primordial beast. Whatever secrets Edmund Whitmore had taken to his grave, Tuppence reflected they had certainly not died with him. Indeed, she was beginning to suspect they were only just coming to light. Chapter 5. The Sudden Collapse. The family vault proved to be an imposing structure carved directly into the hillside, its entrance flanked by weathered stone angels whose faces had been worn smooth by decades of Yorkshire weather. The iron gates, black with age and adorned with a Whitmore coat of arms, stood open to reveal a darkness that seemed to swallow the pale winter light. Rather cheerful, Tuppence murmured as they approached the entrance. Nothing quite like a tomb to lift the spirits on a snowy morning. I've always found crypts remarkably honest places, Tommy replied thoughtfully. No pretense, no social niceties, just the basic facts of mortality. How refreshingly philosophical of you, darling, Tuppence replied, though I suspect this particular crypt may have more to offer than basic facts. The procession had slowed as they reached the vault, with Lord Whitmore and the pallbearers, Sir Reginald, Dr. Hawkes, Philip Whitmore, and 2 estate workers, positioning themselves to carry Edmund's coffin down the stone steps into the family resting place. Reverend Blackwood stood at the entrance, his prayer book open, but his eyes scanning the assembled mourners with what might have been professional concern or something more specific. Tuppence positioned herself where she could observe both the proceedings and the faces of their fellow mourners. The snow continued its relentless fall, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for the solemn ceremony. Miss Field stood apart from the others, her face pale above her black coat, while the cousins had drawn together in whispered conference that seemed oddly inappropriate for the gravity of the moment. It was then that she noticed the footprints. In the fresh snow around the vault entrance, partially obscured but still visible, was a confused pattern of tracks that suggested recent activity. Not the orderly procession they were currently forming, but something more hurried and irregular, as though someone had visited this place in haste, perhaps during the night or early morning hours. "Tommy?" she whispered, nudging him gently. The snow near the entrance. He followed her gaze, and his eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting. Either someone has been preparing for this morning's ceremony with unusual thoroughness, or... His observation was cut short by a commotion near the vault entrance. Dr. Hawkes, who had been examining the stone carvings with his usual enthusiasm, suddenly staggered backward, his face gone alarmingly white. "I say," he gasped, one hand pressed to his chest. "Most extraordinary. Most disturbing." For a moment, everyone stood frozen in tableau, unsure whether the good doctor was suffering from the cold, the emotion of the occasion, or something more serious. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the snow-covered ground with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the winter silence. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. "Lady," Margaret gave a small shriek and pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Philip Whitmore dropped his end of the coffin with a bang that echoed off the stone angels. Sir Reginald barked orders for someone to fetch brandy, and Miss Field surprised everyone by immediately kneeling beside the fallen man with the competence of someone familiar with medical emergencies. "Give him air," she commanded crisply, her earlier timidity vanishing in the face of crisis. "Dr. Hawkes, can you hear me?" Tommy was already moving, his military training evident in the calm efficiency with which he helped to support the unconscious man. But Tuppence, while concerned for Dr. Hawkes's welfare, found her attention drawn to other details that the sudden drama had revealed. In the confusion, several objects had been scattered across the snow. Dr. Hawkes's omnipresent leather satchel had fallen open, spilling its contents, notebooks, pencils, and what appeared to be several old documents that had no business being in a historian's casual possession. More intriguingly, a small glass vial had rolled away from the fallen man, coming to rest against one of the stone steps leading into the vault. She also noticed that in dropping his end of the coffin, Philip Whitmore had torn his black glove, revealing fingernails that were stained with what looked suspiciously like the same white powder they had observed in the chapel. And near the vault entrance, partially hidden by a fallen wreath, was what appeared to be a fragment of cloth, dark wool, freshly torn, with a distinctive pattern that she was certain she'd seen recently. "Someone should fetch Lord Whitmore," Reverend Blackwood said, with the authority of a man accustomed to managing crises. "And perhaps we should postpone the interment until Dr. Hawkes has recovered." "Nonsense!" came a weak but determined voice from the snow. Dr. Hawkes was struggling to sit up, supported by Tommy and Miss Field. "Just a momentary dizzy spell. The cold, you know, and the emotion of the occasion." But Tuppence had caught something in his voice. Not weakness or confusion, but fear. Whatever had caused his collapse, it hadn't been a simple case of overwrought nerves. "What did you see?" she asked quietly, kneeling beside him, while the others argued about whether to continue the ceremony. Dr. Hawkes's eyes met hers, and she saw confirmation of her suspicion. "Inside the vault," he whispered, so low that only she could hear. "Something's been moved. Recently moved." Before she could ask for clarification, Lord Whitmore arrived at a run, having been alerted by Oliver the footman. His face was flushed with cold and concern as he surveyed the scene, his brother's coffin resting awkwardly on its supports, one of his guests collapsed in the snow, and the rest of the party milling about in various states of distress. "Good heavens, what's happened here?" The explanations came in a confused chorus, but through it all, Tuppence found herself studying the vault entrance more carefully. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see clear evidence that the heavy stone slab that served as an inner door had been recently disturbed. The snow that had drifted against it showed clear scrape marks, and there were fragments of stone and mortar scattered on the steps that spoke of recent and possibly hasty activity. "Perhaps," she suggested diplomatically, "we might postpone the ceremony until Dr. Hawkes is fully recovered. It seems rather unkind to continue while one of our number is unwell." "Absolutely not," Dr. Hawkes protested, though he accepted Tommy's assistance in getting to his feet. "Edmund deserves his final rest, and I won't be the cause of further delay." But as the pallbearers reorganized themselves and prepared to proceed into the vault, Tuppence noticed that Sir Reginald was studying the fallen historian with an intensity that went far beyond polite concern. His pale eyes were calculating, assessing, and when Dr. Hawkes met his gaze, the older man quickly looked away. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed. What had begun as a solemn farewell had taken on an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with secrets that were becoming increasingly difficult to contain. As they finally laid Edmund Whitmore to rest in the family vault, Tuppence found herself wondering whether they were burying a man who had died of natural causes, or whether they were conducting the funeral of someone who had discovered far more than was safe for his continued health. The snow continued to fall, covering the footprints and scattered evidence, but not before she'd committed every detail to memory. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Family Vault. The afternoon found the manor shrouded in an atmosphere of subdued tension that had little to do with the solemnity appropriate to a day of mourning. Dr. Hawkes had been settled in the library with a generous measure of Lord Whitmore's finest brandy, though Tuppence noticed he seemed more interested in watching the doorway than in recovering from his earlier collapse. "I do think," she remarked to Tommy as they lingered in the great hall, ostensibly admiring a particularly gloomy portrait of some long-dead Whitmore ancestor, "that our good doctor's recovery has been remarkably swift for a man who suffered such a dramatic episode." Almost as though his collapse was prompted more by shock than by physical infirmity, Tommy agreed quietly. "The question is, what exactly did he see in that vault to affect him so profoundly?" Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of James, whose usually impassive expression showed the faintest trace of agitation. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. Lord Whitmore wonders if you might join him in his study. He has something he wishes to discuss with you privately." They exchanged glances. In their experience, private discussions during house parties rarely involved pleasant social chit-chat. Lord Whitmore's study was a masculine retreat of leather-bound books and hunting trophies, dominated by a massive fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully despite the grim circumstances. Their host stood with his back to the flames, his face drawn with worry that went beyond simple grief. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to 2 leather armchairs. "I find myself in rather an awkward position, and I believe I require the advice of people with your particular expertise." "We're entirely at your service," Tommy replied diplomatically. "Lord?" Whitmore moved to his desk and withdrew a key. From his waistcoat pocket, an ornate affair that looked decidedly medieval. "This morning's incident with Dr. Hawkes has forced my hand somewhat. You see, there are certain family matters, historical irregularities. One might say that my brother Edmund had been investigating with perhaps more enthusiasm than discretion." Tuppence leaned forward with interest. "The same irregularities that Miss Field mentioned yesterday?" "Among others." Lord Whitmore's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Edmund had developed certain theories about our family's past that, while academically fascinating, could prove socially embarrassing if widely circulated. Nothing criminal, you understand, but the kind of historical untidiness that modern families prefer to keep private." He paused, turning the key over in his fingers. "This key opens a particular section of the family vault, a chamber that has been sealed for the better part of 2 centuries. And you believe Edmund accessed this chamber recently?" Tuppence inquired. "I'm certain of it. Yesterday evening, after you'd all retired, I discovered that this key was missing from its usual place in my desk. It was returned sometime during the night, but..." He trailed off, clearly struggling with some internal debate. "But you suspect someone else knows of Edmund's discoveries," Tommy finished. "Precisely. And this morning's collapse by Dr. Hawkes suggests that whatever Edmund found, it's knowledge that could prove dangerous in the wrong hands." Tuppence felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to reveal its true complexity. "You're asking us to investigate. I'm asking you to help me understand what my brother discovered before someone else decides to act upon that knowledge. The vault incident this morning was not an accident. I'm convinced of it." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged another of their meaningful glances. "What exactly do you suspect we might find in this sealed chamber?" Tommy asked. "Old documents primarily, letters, deeds, family records that were deemed too sensitive for general access when they were sealed away." Lord Whitmore moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. "But Edmund mentioned something in his last letter to me. Something about discovering proof of what he called a remarkable deception that had shaped our family's fortune for generations. And you believe this deception might provide someone with a motive for intrigue. Tuppence left the sentence delicately unfinished, for ensuring that Edmund's discoveries died with him. The words hung in the air like an accusation. After a moment's consideration, Tommy nodded. "We'll need access to the vault, of course. Tonight, after the household has retired, James will provide you with lanterns and ensure that you're not disturbed." Lord Whitmore's relief was evident. "I must warn you, however, if my suspicions are correct, there may be others who are equally interested in accessing that chamber." They returned to the common areas of the house to find the other guests engaged in the kind of subdued conversation typical of morning households. Dr. Hawkes sat near the fire, apparently absorbed in one of his historical texts, though Tuppence noticed his eyes following the movements of the other guests with unusual attention. Miss Field occupied a corner chair, her knitting needles clicking with mechanical precision, while the cousins Philip and Winifred maintained their pattern of whispered conferences. Sir Reginald was notably absent, and when Tuppence inquired casually about his whereabouts, Lady Margaret's response was vague. "Oh, Reggie mentioned something about taking a walk despite the weather. You know how restless men can become when confined indoors?" But Tommy, who had positioned himself near the window, caught Tuppence's eye and shook his head slightly. Whatever Sir Reginald was doing, it wasn't taking a constitutional in the snow. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the manor grew increasingly strained. Conversations died abruptly when certain people entered rooms, and Tuppence noticed that several of the guests seemed to be waiting for something, though whether it was an opportunity or a revelation, she couldn't determine. It was during tea that the next significant incident occurred. Oliver, the nervous footman, was serving from a heavy silver tray when he stumbled slightly near Miss Field's chair. The mishap sent a delicate china cup crashing to the floor, but more importantly, it caused him to drop something from his pocket, a small brass key that landed with a distinct chime on the hearthstones. The young man's face went scarlet as he scrambled to retrieve both the broken china and the key, but not before Tuppence had observed that it was identical in design to the vault key Lord Whitmore had shown them earlier. "How clumsy of me," Oliver stammered, his hands shaking as he gathered the fragments. "I do beg everyone's pardon." Miss Field's reaction was particularly interesting. Her knitting needles had stopped moving entirely, and her face had gone quite pale. When Oliver hurried from the room with his tray and the broken cup, she remained motionless for several long moments before resuming her work with deliberate concentration. "Fascinating," Tommy murmured when they found themselves momentarily alone near the refreshment table. "Indeed, it seems our young footman has been conducting his own investigations into the family vault, or acting on behalf of someone else who prefers to keep their hands clean." As evening approached, and the household began to settle into the routines of morning, Tommy and Tuppence retired to their room to prepare for their nocturnal expedition. The cryptic note they'd discovered in Edmund's study seemed to pulse with new significance. "Not all is as it seems beneath the frost. I have the distinct feeling," Tuppence said, as she selected a warm coat suitable for underground exploration, "that we're about to discover exactly what our departed Edmund meant by that observation." "Let's hope," Tommy replied, checking his pocket watch, "that we're the only ones planning a midnight visit to the family secrets." Outside their window, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed the approaching hour of their appointment with whatever truths lay hidden in the sealed chamber of the Whitmore family vault. Chapter 7. Clues. Among the gravestones. The clock in the great hall struck midnight with sonorous authority as Tommy and Tuppence made their way silently through the manor's corridors. James had been as good as his word, providing them with shuttered lanterns and a detailed map of the vault's interior that looked as though it had been drawn by someone with intimate knowledge of the underground. Chambers, rather like a treasure map, Tuppence whispered as they slipped out through the conservatory doors into the snow-laden night. Though I suspect what we're hunting for may prove more dangerous than doubloons. The snow had finally ceased, leaving the landscape transformed into a crystalline wonderland that sparkled in the pale moonlight. Their breath-formed silver clouds as they made their way carefully along the path toward the family vault. The beam of Tommy's lantern cast weird shadows among the ancient headstones that dotted the family cemetery. I do hope, Tommy murmured, adjusting his grip on the ornate key Lord Whitmore had entrusted to them, that we're not about to discover something that will require us to spend the remainder of our visit avoiding murderous relatives. Where's your sense of adventure, darling? Besides, we faced worse odds than a handful of potentially homicidal mourners. As they approached the vault entrance, Tuppence immediately noticed something that made her pulse quicken. In the pristine snow around the iron gates, a fresh set of footprints was clearly visible. And they were not alone. At least 3 different sets of tracks led to and from the vault, suggesting that their midnight expedition was not as original as they had hoped. It appears, she observed quietly, that we're not the first to think of nocturnal investigation. Tommy examined the tracks more closely, his military training evident in the methodical way he assessed the evidence. 1 set heading in, 2 sets heading out, and unless I'm much mistaken, at least one of these belongs to someone wearing evening shoes rather than proper outdoor boots. How delightfully mysterious. Shall we see what drew our predecessors to this charming spot? The vault gate stood slightly ajar, confirming their suspicions about recent visitors. Inside, the narrow stone steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light. The air was heavy with the scent of old stone and something else, something recent and incongruous in this ancient place. Perfume, Tuppence identified after a moment. Ladies' perfume, and not the sort one would expect to encounter in a crypt. They descended carefully, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The main chamber of the vault was larger than expected, with stone sarcophagi arranged in orderly rows according to the generations they represented, but it was the far wall that drew their attention. There, partially concealed behind an ornate memorial to some long-dead Whitmore patriarch, was an opening that had clearly been recently cleared of debris. The sealed chamber, Tommy said softly. And someone has definitely been here before us. The hidden room beyond proved to be smaller, but more intriguing than the main vault. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled with metal document boxes and leather portfolios that had been protected from moisture and decay by the careful construction of their hiding place. But what immediately caught their attention was the evidence of very recent disturbance. Several of the document boxes lay open, their contents scattered across a stone table that had obviously been designed for exactly this purpose. Papers were strewn about with the haste of someone searching for specific information, and Tuppence noticed that many of the documents bore official seals and legal terminology that suggested matters of considerable importance. Marriage certificates, Tommy read, picking up one of the scattered papers. Property deeds, birth records. He held up a thick parchment covered in elaborate legal script. A will, by the look of it, and not a recent one. Tuppence was examining another set of documents when she made a discovery that caused her to draw in her breath sharply. Tommy, look at this. She held up a letter written in a familiar hand, the same elegant script they'd seen in the cryptic note found in Edmund's study. But this correspondence was addressed to someone identified only as R.A. and dated just 1 week before Edmund's death. My dear Reggie, she read aloud, your concerns about discretion are noted, but I fear the truth has a way of revealing itself regardless of our preferences. The documents I have discovered in the sealed chamber prove beyond doubt that the current inheritance is based upon a falsification that has stood unchallenged for nearly 2 centuries. I believe you will find the implications as disturbing as I do. Tommy whistled softly. Sir Reginald Ashton. So Edmund had confided his discoveries to his old friend, and apparently Reggie was less than pleased about the prospect of those discoveries becoming public knowledge. Tuppence continued reading. The letter goes on to mention specific documents that prove what Edmund calls the substitution, though he doesn't elaborate on exactly what was substituted for what. A sound from the main chamber made them both freeze. Footsteps, careful, but distinct, descending the stone stairs. Tommy quickly extinguished their lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness, while Tuppence gathered up the scattered documents with hands that had learned stealth through years of practice. The footsteps paused at the entrance to the hidden chamber, and in the faint glow of an approaching light, they could see a figure silhouetted against the stone archway. The newcomer wore a heavy coat and moved with the caution of someone familiar with the vault's layout, but the shadows made identification impossible. For several tense moments, the 3 of them remained motionless, the unknown visitor apparently listening for sounds of occupancy, while Tommy and Tuppence scarcely dared to breathe. Then, with obvious reluctance, the figure retreated, and they heard the footsteps ascending the stairs with considerably more haste than they had descended. Well, Tuppence whispered when the sounds had faded completely. That was rather more excitement than I'd bargained for. Tommy relit their lantern with steady hands. The question is whether our mysterious visitor was coming to retrieve something, or to verify that someone else hadn't been here first. They spent another quarter-hour examining the remaining documents, uncovering a story that grew more intriguing with each revelation. The sealed chamber contained evidence of what appeared to be a systematic deception dating back to the early 19th century, involving forged documents, substituted identities, and property transfers that had no legal foundation. It's rather like a Gothic novel, Tuppence observed as they prepared to leave. Secret chambers, forged inheritances, and mysterious deaths. All we need is a mad woman in the attic. Let's hope we don't discover one, Tommy replied with feeling. As they made their way back through the main vault, Tuppence noticed something they had missed on their initial passage, a piece of torn fabric caught on one of the iron brackets that supported the memorial plaques. The material was dark wool of good quality and appeared to have been snagged recently. From our earlier visitor's coat, do you think? She asked, carefully extracting the fragment. Most likely, though it could equally well belong to any of our fellow guests who decided on a bit of midnight archaeology. They emerged from the vault to find the night air surprisingly mild, as though the weather was finally beginning to turn. The snow around the entrance showed even more evidence of recent activity than when they had arrived, with footprints leading off in several directions among the ancient headstones. Tommy, Tuppence said suddenly, pointing toward a section of the cemetery they had not previously examined. What do you make of those? In the moonlight, a trail of disturbed snow led from the vault toward a cluster of older gravestones, where something dark was visible against the white ground. They followed the trail carefully, their lantern revealing a scene that raised more questions than it answered. Near an elaborate Victorian monument, someone had clearly been digging, not extensively, but enough to disturb the frozen ground beneath the snow. A small pile of earth was visible, along with what appeared to be fragments of metal that glinted in their lantern light. Rather an odd place for midnight gardening, Tommy observed. Tuppence knelt to examine the disturbed ground more closely. And rather an odd time of year for it, unless, of course, someone was burying something they preferred to keep hidden. The metal fragments proved to be pieces of what had once been a small casket or strongbox, though whatever it had contained was now gone. But near the base of the monument, partially concealed by snow that had been hastily scattered over it, was something that made both of them draw breath sharply. A torn page from what was clearly a modern document, bearing the letterhead of a London legal firm and a date from just 3 weeks prior, shortly before Edmund Whitmore's sudden death. It would appear, Tommy said grimly, that our midnight visitor was not the first to think of concealing evidence among the family graves. You know, Tuppence said as they made their way back to the manor. Through the crystalline night, both of us carry the uncomfortable certainty that Edmund Whitmore's death was connected to secrets that someone would kill to protect. Chapter 8, Whispers in the Snow. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over Whitmore Manor, finding Tommy and Tuppence at the breakfast table considerably earlier than was their usual custom. The events of the previous night had left them both with an urgent need to observe their fellow guests in the unguarded moments. Before the day's social facades were fully in place, you look remarkably alert for someone who spent half the night exploring underground chambers, Tommy observed, buttering his toast with deliberate care. The benefits of an active life, darling, Tuppence replied, though I confess, the coffee is proving essential this morning. She glanced toward the doorway as footsteps approached. And here comes our first subject for observation. Sir Reginald entered the breakfast room with his usual confident bearing, but Tuppence noticed immediately that his right hand bore fresh scratches, and there was a small tear in his coat sleeve that hadn't been there the previous evening. His greeting was cordial enough, but his pale eyes held a weariness that suggested he too had enjoyed little sleep. Terrible business about poor Dr. Hawkes yesterday, he remarked, settling at the table with his plate. I do hope the excitement hasn't put everyone off their rest. On the contrary, Tommy replied smoothly. We found the evening air quite invigorating. There's something about winter nights that makes one appreciate the warmth of home. Sir Reginald's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and for just a moment his carefully maintained composure slipped. Indeed, though I should think most sensible people would prefer to remain indoors on such a night. Before either could respond, Miss Field appeared in the doorway, her usually neat appearance showing signs of strain. Her hair was less perfectly arranged than usual, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. Most tellingly, her coat hung over her arm, and Tuppence could see that it bore fresh stains from what looked remarkably like damp earth. Good morning, she said quietly, though her gaze lingered on Sir Reginald with obvious anxiety. I trust everyone slept well despite the circumstances. Like the proverbial log, Tuppence replied cheerfully, though I thought I heard someone moving about rather late. Old houses do carry sound so peculiarly. Miss Field's color rose slightly. The wind, perhaps. It was quite fierce during the night, but Tommy had noted that the previous evening had been remarkably still, and he exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife. The arrival of the cousins, Philip and Winifred, brought a different sort of tension to the breakfast room. They entered together, as was their habit, but their usual whispered conferences had been replaced by a strange silence that suggested recent disagreement. Philip's nervous manner was more pronounced than ever, and his hand shook slightly as he reached for the marmalade. Winifred, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with some internal debate. She kept glancing toward the windows that looked out over the grounds, and when Sir Reginald asked casually about her plans for the day, her response was so evasive as to be almost suspicious. I thought I might take a walk, she said finally. The fresh air seems advisable after yesterday's difficulties. Rather brave of you, Tommy observed. The paths must still be treacherous with all that snow. I'm quite sure-footed, Winifred replied, though something in her tone suggested she was thinking of more than simple navigation. Dr. Hawkes was the last to appear, arriving with James, who seemed to be hovering with unusual attention. The historian's color was better than it had been the previous day, but there was a jumpiness about his manner that reminded Tuppence of a rabbit sensing foxes in the vicinity. "Feeling more yourself this morning, Dr. Hawkes?" she inquired kindly. "Oh, yes, much better, thank you," he replied, "though I confess I've been having the most peculiar dreams. Quite vivid, actually, all about secret chambers and hidden documents." He laughed nervously. "The mind does play such tricks when one is overwrought." Sir Reginald's fork clattered against his plate. "Dreams can be terribly realistic, can't they? Sometimes it's difficult to know where imagination ends and memory begins." The conversation continued in this vein of careful verbal fencing until Lord Whitmore appeared, looking haggard and older than his years. He nodded to the assembled company but said little, merely requesting that James inform him immediately if any of the guests required anything unusual. It was only when the breakfast party began to disperse that the morning's real drama began to unfold. Tuppence had positioned herself near the conservatory windows, ostensibly admiring Lady Margaret's winter plantings, when she observed something that made her blood quicken with excitement. In the snow-covered garden beyond, two figures were engaged in what was clearly an intense and clandestine conversation. Miss Field and Sir Reginald stood partially concealed behind an ornamental hedge, their body language speaking of urgency and disagreement. Though she couldn't hear their words through the glass, their gestures were eloquent enough. Miss Field appeared to be pleading about something, her hands clasped before her in obvious distress. Sir Reginald's responses were sharp and dismissive, his aristocratic bearing emphasized by the way he towered over the smaller woman. At one point, he grasped her arm with sufficient force to make her wince, and Tuppence saw her mouth form words that looked very much like, "Please, no more." Tommy appeared at her elbow, following her gaze with interest. "Rather an early morning for garden consultations," he murmured. "I suspect they're discussing something considerably more pressing than horticultural matters," Tuppence replied softly as they watched. The conversation reached what appeared to be a crucial point. Sir Reginald withdrew something from his coat pocket, a folded paper, that he showed to Miss Field with unmistakable menace. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She stepped backward as though struck, her hand pressed to her throat in the universal gesture of shock. Then Sir Reginald committed what proved to be a fatal error in judgment. In his apparent anger, he raised his voice just enough for fragments of his words to carry across the snowy garden to where other guests were beginning to emerge for their morning constitutionals. "Won't hesitate to use it," drifted clearly through the still air, followed by Miss Field's anguished reply, "Edmund never meant for anyone to die." The effect was electric. Dr. Hawkes, who had been shuffling along the garden path with apparent aimlessness, stopped so abruptly that he nearly lost his footing. Philip and Winifred, engaged in their own whispered conference near the rose arbor, turned as one toward the sound of raised voices. Even Oliver, visible through the kitchen window, paused in his duties to stare toward the hedge, where the two figures stood locked in their desperate colloquy. But it was the arrival of Lord Whitmore himself that brought the garden drama to an abrupt conclusion. He appeared on the terrace with the purposeful stride of a man who had reached the end of his patience, and his voice carried with the authority of generations of landowners when he called out, "Reginald, Eleonora, I believe we need to have a conversation, all of us, in my study now." The various guilty parties began moving toward the house with the reluctant compliance of children caught in mischief. But Tuppence noticed that each of them was calculating, assessing, and preparing for what promised to be a confrontation that would finally bring Edmund Whitmore's secrets into the light. "Well, Tommy said quietly, as they prepared to follow the procession indoors. "It appears our midnight discoveries are about to prove their worth." "Indeed," Tuppence replied, "though I suspect the next hour may be considerably more dangerous than our adventure in the vault." Chapter 9. The Culprit Exposed. Lord. Whitmore's study had never seemed smaller than it did that morning. With all the house guests assembled in uncomfortable proximity, while tension crackled in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, the fire blazed cheerfully in the grate, but its warmth did nothing to dispel the chill that had settled over the room's occupants. Tommy and Tuppence had positioned themselves near the window where they could observe both the assembled company and Lord Whitmore, who stood behind his desk with the bearing of a man preparing for battle. His face was grim with resolution, and in his hands he held a thick folder that clearly contained more than casual correspondence. "I believe," Lord Whitmore began without preamble, "that we have all been dancing around certain uncomfortable truths for quite long enough. My brother Edmund's death was not the natural occurrence we have all been pretending it to be." The reaction was immediate and varied. Miss Field pressed her handkerchief to her lips with a small gasp, while Sir Reginald's face assumed the carefully neutral expression of a diplomat hearing unwelcome news. Dr. Hawkes shifted nervously in his chair, and the cousins Philip and Winifred exchanged one of their meaningful glances. "Charles," Sir Reginald said smoothly, "I hardly think wild accusations are appropriate at such a time." "We're all grieving, are we?" Lord Whitmore interrupted sharply, "because it seems to me that several people in this room have been far more interested in what Edmund discovered than in mourning his passing." Tuppence leaned forward slightly, her trained eye cataloging the reactions around the room. It was a technique she and Tommy had perfected over years of detecting. Watch not just who speaks, but who doesn't, and more importantly, who tries to direct the conversation away from dangerous territory. "Perhaps," Tommy suggested diplomatically, "you might share with us exactly what Edmund discovered that has caused such concern?" Lord Whitmore opened the folder, withdrawing several documents that Tuppence recognized as originals of the papers they had examined in the vault. "My brother uncovered evidence of a systematic deception that has affected this family for nearly 2 centuries. The current inheritance of the Whitmore estate is based upon forged documents and substituted identities." "Preposterous," Philip Whitmore spluttered, his pale face flushing with indignation. "The family records are perfectly legitimate." "Are they?" Lord Whitmore's voice cut through the protest like a blade, "because Edmund's research proved otherwise. The man we have always believed to be our great-grandfather was actually an imposter who assumed the identity of the rightful heir after the latter's convenient death in a riding accident. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Even the fire seemed to crackle more quietly, as though the very house was holding its breath." Tuppence found herself studying the faces around the room with renewed interest. Sir Reginald's aristocratic composure was showing definite cracks, while Miss Field had gone so pale that she appeared almost transparent. But it was Dr. Hawkes's reaction that caught her attention. The historian was staring at Lord Whitmore with an expression of horrified fascination. "The word documents in the sealed vault," Dr. Hawkes whispered. "I knew there was something wrong about them when I saw—" He stopped abruptly, his hand flying to his mouth as though to recall the words. "When you saw what, Doctor?" Tommy inquired gently. "Nothing. That is, I merely meant that the historical implications are quite staggering." But Tuppence had caught the slip, and more importantly, she had observed Sir Reginald's sharp look in the historian's direction. "Dr. Hawkes," she said with deceptive casualness, "you mentioned yesterday that something had been moved in the vault. What exactly did you see?" The poor man seemed to shrink into his chair. That is, the arrangement of the documents had been disturbed. Someone had been through them recently, Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, Lord Whitmore added grimly. Someone who had been informed of Edmund's discoveries and realized the implications. Sir Reginald finally abandoned his diplomatic facade. See here, Charles, if you're suggesting that I had anything to do with Edmund's death simply because he chose to confide his historical theories to me. Theories? Tuppence interrupted, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. But they weren't theories, were they, Reginald? Edmund had proof. Documentary evidence that would have exposed not just an old family secret, but a current legal fraud that affects the rightful ownership of this estate. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the satisfying precision of a well-made clock. She could see it now, the network of guilt and complicity that had led to Edmund's death. The question, Tommy continued smoothly, picking up his wife's thread of reasoning, is what Sir Reginald stood to lose if Edmund's discoveries became public. Miss Field made a sound that was half sob, half moan. Please, she whispered, no more. I can't bear it. Miss Field, Tuppence said gently but firmly, you worked closely with Edmund. You knew about his research, and you also knew that Sir Reginald had reasons for wanting that research to remain secret. Eleanora was protecting me, Sir Reginald said sharply. She had nothing to do with murdering Edmund, Tommy finished. No, I don't think she did. But she certainly helped conceal the crime afterward. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sir Reginald's face had gone white, but his eyes held the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. You have no proof, he said finally. Don't we? Tuppence withdrew the torn fragment of fabric they had found in the vault. Excellent quality wool, Sir Reginald. The same pattern as your winter coat, I believe. Rather careless to leave evidence behind during your midnight visit to the vault. And then there's the matter of the glass vial that rolled away from Dr. Hawkes when he collapsed, Tommy added. Small enough to be easily concealed. The perfect size for carrying a concentrated dose of digitalis, readily available to anyone with knowledge of heart medications, and virtually undetectable in a man already known to have a weak constitution. Sir Reginald's composure cracked entirely. Edmund was going to destroy everything. Do you understand what his ridiculous historical crusade would have cost? Not just the estate, but reputations, family names, financial ruin for dozens of people whose only crime was trusting in the legitimacy of legal documents. So you decided to silence him, Lord Whitmore said with quiet fury. I tried to reason with him, offered him money, position, anything he wanted, but he was obsessed with what he called historical truth. He wouldn't listen to sense. Miss Field's sobs filled the silence that followed. I tried to stop him, she whispered. After Edmund collapsed, I knew what Reginald had done, but I was so frightened. The scattered gloves in the drawing room, Tuppence realized suddenly. You dropped them when you were searching for the vial after it fell from your pocket. And the powder trail in the chapel, Tommy added. Evidence of where you prepared the dose. Sir Reginald sagged in his chair, the fight gone out of him. Edmund was my oldest friend, but he would have ruined so many lives for the sake of moldy old documents. Instead, Lord Whitmore said with cold finality, you ruined his. As James was summoned to send word to the local constabulary, Tuppence reflected on the tragic irony of it all. Edmund Whitmore had died not for treasure or passion, but for the truth about events that had occurred more than a century before his birth. Rather a waste, she murmured to Tommy as Sir Reginald was led away. Indeed, Tommy replied, though I suspect the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of who tries to bury it. Outside, the winter sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow that would soon begin to melt, revealing whatever secrets still lay hidden beneath the frost. Chapter 10. After the Morning. 3 days later, Whitmore Manor had settled into an atmosphere that was considerably lighter than grief alone could account for. The Yorkshire Constabulary had departed with their prisoner, taking with them the oppressive sense of secrets lurking in every shadow. Even the weather seemed to reflect the change. Bright February sunshine streamed through the tall windows, turning the remaining snow into a carpet of diamonds. Tommy and Tuppence sat in the morning room with Lord and Lady Whitmore, enjoying what had become a ritual of post-crisis reflection. The tea was excellent, the fire warm, and the conversation had that particular quality of people who had survived something unpleasant together and were now free to examine it from a safe distance. "I still find it difficult to believe," Lady Margaret said, refilling Tuppence's cup with practiced grace. "Reginald seemed such a gentleman, so distinguished, so proper." "In my experience," Tuppence replied thoughtfully, "the most dangerous people are often those who appear most respectable. Genuine villains rarely advertise their intentions with dramatic cloaks and sinister mustaches. Though they do occasionally betray themselves with torn coat sleeves and guilty consciences," Tommy added with a slight smile. "Sir Reginald might have succeeded if he hadn't been quite so nervous about covering his tracks." Lord Whitmore stirred his tea with mechanical precision, his expression still troubled despite the resolution of the immediate crisis. "The irony is that Edmund's discoveries, while historically fascinating, would never have resulted in any legal challenge to the estate. The statute of limitations alone would have protected us, not to mention the centuries of legitimate inheritance that followed the original irregularity." "You mean Sir Reginald killed your brother for nothing?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice sharp with indignation. "Not for nothing," Tuppence corrected gently. "For fear. Fear of scandal? Of social embarrassment? Of having to acknowledge that his own family's position might have been built on something less than perfect legitimacy? Pride, in other words, dressed up as practicality." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Miss Field entered with the hesitant manner of someone still uncertain of her welcome. She had aged visibly over the past few days, but there was a lightness about her that suggested the lifting of a tremendous burden. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said quietly. "I wanted to thank you both before I leave for London." "Please sit down," Lord Whitmore said with genuine warmth. "You're hardly an intruder, Eleonora. If anything, we owe you our gratitude for finally finding the courage to speak the truth." Miss Field settled into a chair with obvious relief. "I should have spoken sooner. If I hadn't been so frightened of Sir Reginald, perhaps we might have avoided some of the unpleasantness." "Fear makes cowards of us all at times," Tommy observed diplomatically. "The important thing is that justice was ultimately served." "What will you do now?" Tuppence asked with genuine interest. "Will you continue your secretarial work?" A smile, the first genuine one they had seen from her, crossed Miss Field's features. "Actually, Lord Whitmore has offered me a position organizing Edmund's research notes for publication. It seems his historical discoveries, while they proved dangerous in the wrong hands, have considerable academic value." "Edmund would have liked that," Lord Whitmore said softly. "He always believed that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded." As Miss Field took her leave, promising to keep in touch about the publication project, Tuppence found herself reflecting on the various human dramas that had played out around Edmund's death. Each person had reacted according to their nature, the guilty with panic, the innocent with confusion, and the merely frightened with the kind of paralysis that often accompanies moral dilemmas. "I suppose," she said eventually, "we should consider our own departure. Though I confess I've grown rather fond of this place now that it's no longer harboring murderers." "The guest rooms will always be available to you both," Lady Margaret assured them. "Though perhaps next time you might visit during a less eventful period," Tommy laughed. My dear Lady Margaret, eventful periods seem to have a way of finding us regardless of our travel plans. It's become something of an occupational hazard. Speaking of which, Lord Whitmore said with obvious curiosity, what exactly made you suspect Sir Reginald? I thought your reasoning was brilliant, but I confess I missed the crucial clues. Tuppence considered the question seriously. It was partly the small physical evidence, the torn fabric, the scratches on his hands, his knowledge of heart medications, but mostly it was his behavior. He was too interested in controlling the conversation, too quick to deflect attention from Edmund's research, and far too nervous for someone whose only connection to the deceased was old friendship. Plus, Tommy added, there was his reaction when Dr. Hawkes mentioned the disturbed documents in the vault. An innocent person would have been curious. Sir Reginald was clearly worried about what might have been discovered. And the business with Miss Field clinched it, Tuppence continued. His threatening behavior toward her in the garden made it clear that he was using intimidation to maintain her silence. Innocent men don't need to threaten grieving secretaries. Dr. Hawkes appeared in the doorway at that moment, his usual nervous energy replaced by something approaching dignity. The near-death experience seemed to have steadied him considerably, and his greeting was warm without being effusive. I wanted to apologize, he said without preamble, for my rather dramatic collapse at the vault. Most embarrassing, really. Nonsense, Tommy replied. You had every right to be shocked by what you saw. The question is, what exactly did you notice that disturbed you so much? Dr. Hawkes settled his spectacles more firmly on his nose. It was the arrangement of the documents. You see, I'd visited that chamber several times over the years, with Edmund's permission, of course, to study the family records. I knew exactly how everything was supposed to be organized. When I saw that someone had been searching through specific boxes, looking for particular documents, I realized that Edmund's research had attracted dangerous attention. And you suspected murder even then? Tuppence asked. I feared it. Yes. Edmund had confided some of his discoveries to me, and I knew how explosive they could be in the wrong hands. When he died so suddenly, Dr. Hawkes shrugged. Perhaps I've read too many sensation novels, but the coincidence seemed rather suspicious. As the afternoon wore on, and the various conversations wound toward their natural conclusions, Tommy and Tuppence found themselves once again admiring the view from the morning room windows. The snow was melting steadily now, revealing the promise of spring beneath winter's grip. Rather like truth emerging from deception, Tuppence observed with satisfaction. Everything hidden eventually comes to light, given enough time and patience. And occasionally, Tommy added with a grin, a bit of judicious midnight exploration. Are you suggesting that our methods were somewhat irregular? My dear Tuppence, after 30 years of marriage and countless adventures, I wouldn't dream of suggesting that your methods are anything approaching regular. She laughed. That clear, infectious sound that had been one of the first things to charm him about her all those years ago. Well, then shall we consider this case closed and begin planning our next expedition into irregular methods? I thought you'd never ask. Outside, the Yorkshire countryside stretched away under the brightening sky, full of possibilities and promise. Somewhere in that landscape, Tuppence reflected with happy anticipation, another mystery was undoubtedly waiting to challenge their combined wits and test their partnership once again. But for now, it was enough to sit in comfortable chairs, drink excellent tea, and bask in the satisfaction of justice well served and truth finally revealed.